All right, our next talk is by Jim.
Jim works good.
My experience with Charlie Barth and his Solar Mesosphere Explorer project, cheaper, faster, good enough.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks for allowing me to give a quick talk. It's going to be quick. I couldn't figure out how many charts, so I have a 10-minute talk with 30 charts. So we're going to just flash through the middle ones. I'm going to try to cover a couple.
I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Yeah, I'll try to cover a couple. Oh,
Can you move these? Move the mics
up higher.
Higher, yep.
Okay. How about now?
Oh, good.
Good. Okay. So there we go. Here's the agenda, what I'm going to try to cover in 10 minutes. We're going to start off with Charlie working to get SME done. It was not easy. He pulled a lot of strings to get SME approved. A lot of political strings, get it to JPL, and I want to talk a little bit about that. And then he beat on me that there was a success path, a plan, and that required me to do something way different than JPL normally does. I should mention, I was the deputy project manager, ultimately in SME. At the beginning, I was the study lead to try to get costing and stuff. And then I'm going to talk about what some of SME's new innovations were. And I probably will skip through some of those because it's not quite as critical. But it did turn out to be the fastest RFP to contract. It broke a lot of records in a lot of ways. And then I'll go through the chronology. Now, what happens after that is after we did SME, before we were halfway through it, Charlie starts thinking, hey, can we do SME to Mars? I mean, can we do, where I'm the PI, I got the mission ops, I can JPL, I don't need them, I just need to have the science and all this. Can we do this ourselves? So we roughed it out, and it was like 100 to 150 million. I'm going to go through the story of how he sent me out to headquarters to start to walk the halls, pitch this to Shelby, all these people. And pretty soon, it happened. With great adversarial stuff with JPL. This was Charlie, who used to love JPL, and JPL, all of a sudden we went completely adversarial. JPL tried to cut my travel budget, so I was at LASP at the time, so I couldn't go to headquarters. Failing that, Charlie was giving me his travel budget to go pitch this idea. Then they tried to bring me back to JPL, get me off LASP altogether. Charlie and headquarters conspired to have me take a leave from JPL. Diaz and Hinders, they paid Charlie to keep me on the staff so I could continue to promote this low-cost planetary approach, which was diametrically opposed to Voyager, Galileo, Viking. Instead of custom-made Cadillac Rolls Royces, custom fit to the payload, this was take a Volkswagen and fit the payload to the. I'm just realizing, Randy made the comment as I was coming up, he says, you never get past the first chart. So let me try to get through some of these charts. I've given you the outline of the story. Now I'm going to try to put in some of the details. So there was AO7, hundreds, as Gary said, hundreds of bids. It got down to 20 shortlisted ones. And it turns out that Marjorie Townsend Goddard couldn't handle them all, apparently, because when I heard Charlie said he managed to get his broken free and given to JPL. And I also got EUVE, so I was picked up to do 2 studies. Now, when I got him, he said the reason was he couldn't distinguish himself if he had the same design team, study teams, costing out and designing the projects at Goddard with all the other competitors. He wanted to pull his out specifically so he could do something different. So then he had a talk with me as he was bringing it to JPL, and then he sits down and says, interviewing me to be the lead study lead instead of the career study leads that were at JPL. There were guys who did this full-time all their lives. And he said, I don't want another JPL project. You're going to have to break some rules here. Well, I didn't have any rules. I was a young 30-year-old kid. I didn't really have any rules. So he said, we got a success plan here. Success plan is, this has got to be cheap. I can sell the science. You got to make this a bulletproof project, no risks, and cheap, really cheap. So that it's nothing like JPL. So it turns out let's see, have I done all this? Yeah, I think so. Let's keep going. So, in fact, maybe I guess I can see what I'm doing here. Oh, so it turns out, while he wanted me to do this, he says, oh, and by the way, I want to do mission operations myself. JPL had never done that. NASA had never allowed that. JPL had never allowed any one of their spacecraft with their logo on it to be run by anything other than the JPL mission ops. He says, I want to do this with students because I don't like that slow JPL science planning. It's just a pain. I hate it when I'm doing stuff on Mariners and Vikings. He said, I want to do it myself. That's the whole point of being a PI-controlled experiment, a science spacecraft. I'm so young, I don't know the difference. I mean, he's saying, you can do this, let's just do it. Well, the whole trick of doing this was Oh yeah, so we're going to do lean management. So we only had 5 full-time employees, unheard of at JPL, running the whole project. Thin organizations. Let's see. So there was a bunch of new innovations, new kinds of contract, really stiff share curves we imposed on Ball. There's a whole lot of stuff of how we had the real competitors that were bidding was Lockheed with a big CSAT kind of satellite, and Ball that was going to do something clever, spend mass to save schedule, spend mass to save power, spend mass to save everything. And so it turns out we were able to take that delta, and they were cleverly using all the right things. Lockheed had come in with the CSAT team again. The same old standard stuff. Really had to fight hard. I was on the SCB to try to get it away from that and back over to the small, clever guys. Turned out to be that was a winner. I might mention one of the things we did that was unusual. I'm going to mention this because Goddard hated us when we started this. When I was doing these tests, I had Stu Boyers at EUVE and I had Charlie's. Stu didn't care. He never talked to me. Charlie was there before I ever started and said, here's what you got to do, here's what you got to do, we got to break the rules, you got to stay under the radar so nobody sees, all this stuff. And so it turns out, as I'm doing all this, the kind of things we did, for example, when we had the contract with Ball, we stopped before we actually we executed the contract and said, you can start work on some things, but not the data system, because I want the mission ops people to go look what features they want in the data system. And it turns out by cutting the contracts differently, not just letting Ball put in whatever data system they approve, but letting LASP, who had a mission ops responsibility, do that. We actually got a really clever contract. It turns out we let LASP do the attitude determination because Ball didn't care. That was like cleaning the bathrooms. It was just an obligation. They had ongoing obligation after they'd sold the spacecraft. But we knew the scientists would really spend time getting the best answers possible. Anyway, there were a lot of novel things. I won't go through. The key was that JPL allowed all that stuff. Now it turns out they didn't even know. I was under the radar. I would talk occasionally to Giberson, who was head of flight projects. I used to drink with John Cassani because I used to try to get those guys to mentor me. And so they were kind of aware, but the rest of the management never really knew what we were doing. So we were under the radar. Turns out when we got approved, there were some of the guys came to me and said, SME what? What is that? So the upper management at JPL didn't know that we'd even done this or that we'd won. So it turns out there was, immediately, I had kind of at that point aspirations of being a project manager. Immediately they put adult supervision over me because I was just too young and too inexperienced and clearly crazy by JPL's management. So they didn't know how they were going to get out of it now. We'd sold it, they didn't realize how it had gotten out the barn door with all these new things in it. So it turns out, as you may know, it was a big success. The key was designing the payload to fit the satellite. That's where all the savings are. Now all of a sudden you don't have to worry about testing, you don't have to worry about, everything is done the same as a previous satellite. So we thought that was a really great idea. And it turns out, I might mention, when we came up as that's the solution, Charlie had to start to iterate what are the science requirements. He couldn't have, we had to look at how much data rate, and if we had to cut back on the data rate to make it fit an existing satellite or a class of existing satellites, he was really willing to do that. Way different than when I'd worked on Viking and other ones where the scientists expected a custom-made Rolls Royce to pamper their instrument. This was, he really could live, he could walk the talk. Okay, just more stuff. Oh, I mean, it was interesting. Now that SME became a big success, I'll show you, everybody got awards. And Goddard became friends with me then, and Marjorie Townsend, who used to run all the studies, would have me come out and give lectures to her team about how we did SME, the kind of things we did to run it. And in fact, because we had just a thin group, there was no corporate memory of all the stuff. So after the fact, everybody wanted to know, how did you do that? Because we were under budget, had a schedule, and it lasted 7 times longer than we expected. Okay, I'll kind of skip through some of this. So there was the AO thing. This Captain Satellite was because the way I decided to be able to do this was to go out and interview every Earth-orbiting satellite maker in the US. And so I went out to each one of them, found they had different test programs, they had different margins for testing, they had different design capabilities, but they all flew. These were all existing satellites. So I compiled an RFP that said, just give me what you got. You know, and in effect, we're not going to impose for the first time ever, not the JPL test program. You can use whatever test program. So by doing all that, I became the expert at JPL as for satellites. We thought spacecraft are what we called our things that went to the planets. Satellites orbited the Earth. My design team gave me Captain Satellite for my door. So, okay, difference, we got, all this stuff. That's the Delta to the Scout. And that's let's see, this is all stuff you've seen. Oh, here, you can see Randy, you can see your lovely face back in those early days with Elaine Hansen. All of us were a lot skinnier. It turns out that it was a really great team effort by people from Ball, LASP, JPL. And I remember Charlie, I don't think I'm gonna have time to talk about the various things, but there were lots of things with Charlie. Here was our mission ops system again with we had idiot lights and green, yellow, orange screens. And it turns out, again, Ball hated it when I imposed that on him, that we were going to use LASP software, and to make sure we could debug LASP software, we were going to make them test the spacecraft with it. And we were going to test the observatory module with it, because the risky thing was Randy's LASP, this mission ops software. Turns out Ball kicked and screamed, but it was part of the contract, they had to do it. And then they used it, they bid it for the next several jobs. Because we had such skinny management, watching them, nobody, it was me, I was watching both contracts. To save money, I put myself out as the monitor for both contracts. We had this performance measurement system. First time we'd used it, imposed it on Ball, not so much on LASP, we imposed it on Ball. They hit it kicking and screaming, and then they used it for the next several projects. More things. Team launch was very successful. Now, because I want to get to the second part, which is where we took awards for everybody. So, Ball got lots of awards. They got 100% award fee. Everybody got awards. Charlie got, I saw the plaque out there in the display. Everybody was wildly successful. Eventually, we turned it off and it went away. It re-entered. So then, here's the second act. Charlie, before we'd even got to integration between the instruments and the bus, said, Jim, let's do SME to Mars. And I said, okay. Well, it turns out, then I started looking at taking ComSats, like the huge regular geostationary ComSats, and 15-year lifetime spacecraft, production lines, 50 of them punched out. Take the 51st one, what do you have to modify to make that a planetary spacecraft? Turns out that was the 50 to 150 million kind of range. We pitched it all the time up at the top. Turns out that JPL really hated the idea. I went through the story where they tried to cut the budget, and my travel budget, because I was out here as mission director for I was doing SME monitoring. Turns out that Charlie finally they got me hired. Al Diaz and Hinters, they got me hired by funding LASP to have me there. And so Charlie found some way also to use me. I was ALD, but only in name, because whenever there was stuff that was too mundane for him to do, some bureaucratic meeting, he'd stuff me in there and I'd represent LASP. And I'd copied his writing style so much that I could even draft letters for him, which I would. So I was used as just sort of when it wasn't enough value added for him, he'd shove me forward to be the guy. Anyway, we did the pitches. Finally got the NASA decided they would actually fund studies with Ames. Ames came in with the idea that JPL still hated the idea, hated. So NASA said, we're going to let Ames do the low-cost planetary. And JPL sort of said, we're not going to have anything to do with it. Well, so I'm up there at review boards, and I'm hiring some contractors, and it's all done with Ames. And it turns out that as that looked successful, JPL started getting really nervous that there was going to be a Planetary Observer series, and their nemesis, Ames, was going to be the guys doing it like pioneers again. There was very adversarial stuff going on. Charlie and headquarters are defending the project against JPL, which was Don Ray and Lou Allen, those guys. So it turns out we had a Mars water mission, and it was, again, the key is design the payload to fit the satellite. Let me skip some of that. So then what happened is we ended up with a planetary, because that was proven to be great, went through, Code B, everything was great. It was going to become a series. That was the example that set the standard that we could have a series. So the Planetary Observer series got started. Ames was going to get it. There was a Mexican standoff where JPL decided they would allow that to happen. Diaz and the guys at Code S said, you take Stuart to run all your stuff. So he's doing exactly the philosophy that Charlie had, and we'll take Ames out of the picture. You can have the Planetary Observer series. And that's what they decided. So all of a sudden I left JPL, from being hated at JPL, all of a sudden now I'm head of all the advanced programs. I was program manager of Mars Observer, which was the one that followed this. NASA sent a wonderful letter, low cost, that we had revitalized their whole planetary program. And that's it. Oh, I guess just the last step in my career. So as that was all successful, turns out that because I was the Mars Observer program manager, we set the fixed price bid for RCA to build the satellite. 3 kids from Harvard came to JPL and said, we're looking for somebody to be a chief engineer. We're going to start a company. And I said, geez, that'd be kind of fun. Because this thing looked like it was on glide path for success. It turns out it was Orbital Sciences, and it's now a $4.5 billion company and 13,000 people. And it turns out I joined them thinking I'd only last a year or two. It'll go back belly up like they always do. And I come back to JPL because they love me. Turns out I never went back. I'm still an entrepreneur. Okay, and that's it. That's the letter. So, thank you. Sorry I'm late.
Questions?
How much is credit are you going to take for the looming price of Mars Observer?
Oh, yeah. So, I didn't. It turns out, the epilogue, I didn't go through those words, but it launched way late. I left, and it turns out it was supposed to launch 3 years later. Turns out it launched 7 or 8 years later. It went from 300 million when we had it all approved, Code B had gone through it, everybody had agreed on the price, it was 300 million. It launched at 1.3 billion. And then it failed. Right. It turns out Lockheed had like 6 of these, or RCA had 6 of these ComSats, and they all had a problem in the propulsion where there was a leak. And so as soon as you turned it on, it blew up. And it turns out they'd already had a couple of the geostationary ones blow up, but we were in transit. So by the time we turned ours on, there was nothing you could do. Just turn it on and see, and it went dark. So that was the end of that. And the IG said it was everybody's fault. They gave me an award. After the thing died, to make sure it was clear, they gave me an award. And then they said it was the third NASA JPL, that JPL had gone back to business as usual. And they'd since learned their lesson, and now there's low-cost planetary.
So your last remark partially answers my question, but have there been any lasting lessons learned at the centers from this experience?
I think so. From Goddard, they mimicked the way we approached, and I had some of those things. Because I'd give them lectures, they'd have me come and do review boards to see if they were implementing some of the new techniques. And these aren't science techniques, these are just management techniques, but they were successful. And JPL did learn after this terrible thing that happened with Mars Observer.
I'd really like to invite you to come back and give this talk slower so I can see.
I'll be pleased to do that anytime.
One more question.
If somebody asked you what was the cost of SME, not including the delta, what number did you?
The number that we had, I went through a bunch of things because we had changes, but they never gave us any more money for it. And Charlie just said, we're going to eat it because we're not going to go back for more money, or at least I don't want. So it was 14.97 million was what Code B gave us. It's what we had when we started the program, and then they added a dual hybrid G-Staden TDRS transponder. First we were doing G, and all of a sudden it's G-Staden and TDRS. We had to check out TDRS, and we were the first guys to do that. And then they did the Delta. Now that was good for us, but still they did the Delta, and then they added a piggyback to the whole thing, USAT-1, which was Martin Sweeting's first thing. All those things, no scope change, no money. There was scope, but there was no money to us, no increase. So we started at 14.97, we ended at 14.96. I think we deliberately, saved 50,000 or something just so we could underrun the contract.
Did I remember again that we got that Delta from Japan for like 50 cents on the dollar?
Yeah, in fact, that's how it turns out. They didn't give us the Delta because they loved us. They were paying for scouts. Scouts were 7 or 10 million each. The Japanese had a backup launch vehicle that they bought from McDonnell Douglas, a full Delta. They'd never used it, and it was in boxes. It had never been assembled. And they just said, you can have it because we never used it. It was from 10 years earlier, but it was still good. NASA realized that if they paid to have that assembled, it was only going to be a few $1 million versus a $7 to $10 million Scout versus a $50 million Delta. I mean, we were getting it really cheap, but they would actually save money. So they made the switch to save money for themselves. But for us, it was magic, because yeah.
All right, let's take Jim again. Okay. And why are you?